Good evening, everyone. You may have noticed part of the title of tonight is Heads Above the Parapet, which was actually a phrase I used when I was speaking with Amit. The idea being that I am hopefully established enough in my practice that if I put my head above the parapet, it's not going to get shot off, but also I am not protected by a level of seniority and deference that you sometimes get as you progress up the bar. Before we start on my views, and I do have many and strong views about race equality, I just want to get the temperature of the room and ask a few questions. For example, firstly, does anyone here think we live in a post-racial society and that race isn't a problem? Good, so we're not going to skip straight to drinks then. Secondly, is there anyone here who has either been the subject of race discrimination or prejudice or seen other people who've been the subject of it? If it helps, right. And I think the most important question, are you comfortable talking about race? Well, I'd say there are times that I'm not comfortable talking about race, and my personal experience is sometimes those discussions about race are triggered when it is suitable for someone else rather than me. So why am I speaking to you other than the fact I've been invited? I'm not just a barrister, I see myself as an activist. Us activists are those naive people who get angry about things and actually think we can change them. We believe in movements, we believe in doing things together. That isn't something I think naturally comes to a lot of barristers, and I think that can be an important component of this. I just want to reflect on some of my experiences. I think as you're growing up, well, certainly for me, coming from a mixed race background, a lot of my family talked about what I would now consider this kind of colorblind fallacy. If you work hard, if you ditch the accent, you wear the right clothes, and you don't complain, it's all going to be okay. Maybe people will just not realize that you're from a BAME background, or alternatively, they will forget about it. I had a bit of an epiphany. I'm sure some of you will have heard or have read this book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And when I read this book, the author had a very similar experience. There are a lot of people from my background that think if you work hard enough, particularly parents' generation, that all of the issues with race would disappear. And I don't think that really has been people's experience of it. That leads you into situations where you believe that people have forgotten about your race. It's not an issue. And it crops up in very incongruous places. I remember I'd done a very tedious little application in the county court. It was central London when it was based over near Regent's Park. And the judge at the end of the application suddenly said, without announcing any more, "What do you think of burqas, Miss Ibrahim?" And I was completely confused as to why my opinion was being sought on that. And my poor opponent, I remember, had to sit there awkwardly while I cobbled together my views on burqas for about 2 minutes until we could all be released. Now, this is something that affects you in the sense that you can constantly be being what I call othered. You may think that you are part of the bar, you're part of a community, but you get various experiences along the way when you are reminded that people are thinking of you differently, and that can be incredibly disconcerting. We also have to face the reality of the bar. It is, on the whole, at the higher echelons, it can be predominantly white, it can be very middle class, it can be full of quite a lot of high-earning men as well. Now, those individuals are far more likely in their statistical evidence of this to have prejudices, and in my experience, prejudices that they're quite happy to air. That means that sometimes with the bar, and I come from a background where I do more commercial employment work, where you tend to have opponents, particularly in the commercial world, who are more likely to come from white, privileged backgrounds. And that can really affect how they interact with you. And I'm not just talking about them massacring your name. There can be far more material points they can make. But what about my individual perspectives? I think as somebody who's mixed race, I very much believe in an anti-racist movement. You will have seen that there are various subcategories, if you like, of the BAME background. You have Society of Asian Lawyers, you have black lawyers, you have, I know, Pakistani lawyers have set up. It's all of this salami slicing of groups down into almost indivisibly small pockets, and I really am very much against that, because it means, as somebody who's mixed race, you don't necessarily fit into any of those boxes. The terminology of ethnicity and race almost hasn't caught up with what is an increasing mixed race population we have in this country, as rather delightfully people are falling in love with people across all backgrounds, and therefore rendering a lot of prejudice obsolete. Now, that can often mean that the BAME community, and I think this is an assumption a lot of people make, is not one big happy family. You're not either from a white background or a BAME background, and all BAME people feel solidarity together. I remember feeling very caught short when I was at a marketing event with somebody who was from a BAME background, who seemed to suggest that I couldn't understand what she was going through because I was half-caste. What a loathsome, loathsome phrase. If you want to upset me, other than calling me Sarah, calling me half-caste is pretty up there. So the mentality of the BAME community seems sometimes to feed into what I call the Dulux colour chart, that everyone can be arranged from white to black, and most people are trying to shove you into either the white box or the BAME, the black box. And it is really, really unhelpful. Anti-racism is the way forward. You also, on that colour chart notion, get people who like to categorise you according to how you behave. Having a Muslim surname means, particularly after the terrorist attacks, and they were pretty fundamental for how people started to view me, get visibly relaxed when I have a glass of wine. So I'm not going to be one of those dangerous Muslims. I'm probably okay. And I remember this happened at my inn, and I have great affection for my inn. We were at a dining event, and I sat next to a very delightful judge. And he started taking umbrage at the fact that somebody had left the table and they weren't drinking, and she also had a Muslim surname. And he felt the need to comment, so I thought, being slightly more advanced in my career, I could say, well, that's me as well. To which he replied, meaning to be utterly charming, "Don't worry, you look Spanish." So even with the best will in the world, people do say some downright silly things. And I think we need to realise that we need to move not to this subcategorisation of identities, but actually look at ourselves and society and the bar and say we want to be anti-racist. We don't want to be segregating people off into various groups. And one of the reasons I say that, I am sure you have all been invited to one of these wonderful cultural events a lot of these BAME communities put on. I think we have, as a community, as a group, we have tried to sell our culture, love us. If it was really a case that people having a curry would make them less racist, we would be living in a fundamentally different society. So we need to get over this notion that having a Bollywood-themed evening is suddenly going to revolutionise the prejudices of people. We need to park that idea, not stop doing it, but actually realise the limitations of that kind of approach. So when we're looking at an anti-racist society, we also need to understand that intersectionality, which I'm very keen on. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but there are different experiences. I'm sure for those of you who are women and who are from a BAME background, you appreciate you have slightly different experiences. If you are an activist and a woman from a BAME background, if you go to women's groups, they are quite white, I'm afraid. If you go to BAME group activities, it tends to be men who dominate them. So you can very much fall through the cracks. And I would very much love to see the BSB tackling those kinds of issues as well, because I think that really is important. You'll tell me when I'm going over time, I'm sure. The other thing people need to realise, and I think needs to be made very, very evident, is it's quite exhausting talking about race. To come back to a point I made earlier, sometimes those discussions about race are forced upon me at a time where somebody is feeling curious, as opposed to a time of my choosing. Sometimes, if you have any discussion about race and about how uncomfortable it is, you end up being subject to a barrage of being basically accused of being soft or having imagined it and that there's no racism. We need to make sure that these safe spaces don't just exist here, but exist more fully. I am going to put my key asks before I stop, because I think it's always important as an activist, you have asks. What do you want people to do? One, data is very empowering. A lot of the experiences at the bar, I think, are made worse by the fact people feel isolated. I think some of the data that was collected by the BSB on women last year was incredibly helpful in breaking that down, so please keep doing it. Two, I believe in action groups and task force. I would very much encourage the BSB to look at setting one up on race. And three, looking at the levers that we have as a profession to make sure people are bought into anti-racism. I have seen and heard what people put in their equality and diversity box when they're applying to be silk, etc. And some of it's not quite as compelling as I'd like it to be, like having multilingual children who speak French and German isn't quite the kind of equality and diversity point I'd like people to be hitting. And fourth, and most importantly, when you leave this room, I hope you very much feel that you are part of a movement and that you are not by yourself. And I would invite you to take that with you moving forwards. Thank you.